Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. I listened to another Women of Marvel podcast the other day, and it helped answer a couple of questions for me, or clarify the answers to a couple of questions for me about Marvel Comics and comics in general, but we're going to specifically focus on Marvel here because it's the Women of Marvel podcast. And those questions would be, number one, why do you have comic pros deliberately driving away customers? Number two would be, why do you have Marvel spamming out comics? Because that's basically what they do right now. They just spam out comics. And the biggest one was, why do you have some writers looking like they are deliberately trying to fail when they write a story? And those are the questions that really got clarified for me listening to this podcast and thinking about it. And I figured I'd just share that with you with this video. So I've listened to about a dozen of these Women of Marvel podcasts so far, and really only one of them really had merit. And that was the interview with Megan Brandner. And she used to work for Marvel Comics, and she now works for the MCU and Marvel Studios, and she really should be the one running Marvel Comics. And Sana Amanat, who actually runs a podcast and is one of the two presenters or interviewers for the podcast, she kept on trying to drag her into this identity politics kind of language. And this Megan Brandner woman, she just stood her ground and said, no, look, I'm just doing my best. I'm just doing what I can to put these things out there. And I really think this woman should be running Marvel Comics. But for this one that I listened to that just came out, it did have some little hint of merit to it, because they were talking to two writers that work for Marvel, and they have written books for Marvel because Marvel is starting to publish YA novels and middle grade books for these young kids, and they're trying to go further and further in that direction. So you have these two women who have written these kinds of books for Marvel. And if they had laid off the identity politics once again, it would have actually had some merit, because they did have some interesting and really grounded ideas about how to write. Not what to write, but how to actually write. And these things would be good for any person who actually wants to be a writer. They're just basic ideas that should be stuck in your mind. And when they talked about these things, it really drove home what I have been saying in the last number of videos, that Marvel is trying to feminize comics. That's really what they're trying to do, and I would say that DC is not far behind on that as well. But they're trying to feminize comics. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing that they have more female superheroes. That could be great, and more female writers and artists and all that. That could be great as well. But when I say feminizing comics, I mean that they are doing it in a way to attract women and specifically drive away men. Not to include both of them, but specifically to drive the male audience away. And again, of course, this all comes from their ideological bent, which is, for Sana Amanat, identity politics. And why do I always say that? Why does it always come back to that? Because for her, it always comes back to that. And I could see it in the language that she uses, because her educational background is actually very similar to my educational background. We studied basically the same thing. And she uses these phrases and words that to a normal person who hasn't studied these things would not actually see any difference between what she is saying and what they think the definition of the word is. But when you study these things and look at how she actually uses these words, specifically things like identity, things like representation, things like empowerment, when she uses these specific words in these specific ways, it always just boils down to identity politics. And that's what she's trained in, and that's what she goes on about again and again and again. And since she is the number 2 at Marvel, and she probably has the most power at Marvel, and she is the one who is the spokesperson most for Marvel, she's out there all the time. I'll give it to her. She's out there all the time talking and talking. I do indeed focus on what she says, because she says twice as much as everybody else combined. So we do know from different interviews with her and people like Court Lane, who is also a senior VP at Marvel, that they are trying to pull in a young female audience, quite specifically. And I did a video about that. It's called It's About the Message That They Understand from the Content, which is a quote from Court Lane. And I'm going to be referencing a lot of videos that I've done previously, because they have the links in them to all of these interviews and podcasts and panels and everything else that I'm going to be taking these quotes from. And what he talked about in that interview that he did basically was that they're trying to draw in these young girls. And how do they do that? Well, we'll go over that in a little bit, but basically what he said in this interview was they were trying to do things like make facial expressions more in tune with emotion, and to also do things like to give the girls very pretty hair and to make them fashionable. And again, these aren't my words, these are his words. They're trying to draw in the female audience with these kinds of things. And here's where it became interesting for me, because you have these people, they're focused on things like identity politics, right? So they have this far leftist ideology. And in the mind of a far leftist, there is no difference between a man and a woman. That is to say, they see them as the exact same. Not equal, but the exact same. There is a big difference between those two things. And if you have women and men that are the exact same, which they believe that they are, why in the world would you have to target girls specifically with these kinds of things? If they were the exact same, you wouldn't have to do so. You would actually just be doing your normal thing, and it would attract both the girls and the boys. So what they would say that the difference is between girls not reading comics and boys reading comics all the time is because there is a institutional bias. That is to say, this ingrained misogyny and male dominance over the institution of publishing and of comics, and that is what has caused girls not to pick up comics and boys to pick up comics. You and I who live out here in the real world and listen to reality, we would say, look, we have some studies that show that boys are more attracted to the visual in storytelling, whereas girls are more attracted to the intellectual. We have proven this scientifically, but that cuts no ice with them. They don't believe that there's any difference, because those scientific facts would show that there's a difference between men and women. And since their ideology is that there is absolutely no difference, then their answer is that it must be institutional. It is institutional. There's baked in misogyny in the institution of comics, and therefore they have to target girls specifically and bring in all of these female elements in order to destroy the institution as it is and rebuild it up in a way that is actually, quote unquote, equal to both of the sexes. And that's what they're trying to do. And I'll go over a couple of things that they're trying to do in this avenue, which will show to you that these things that they are doing, yes, they are targeted at the female, but they are things that they target at the female which specifically drive away a male audience. So, number one, again, we have Court Lane talking about putting more facial expression in their characters so that the people, girls, can see and identify more with the emotion. Quite specifically, that's why he said it was to be done, because it draws out emotion. And also he talks about making them have pretty hair and fashion. That's very important, apparently. And as I said in my last video, Marvel Comics has a fashion writer who actually simply goes over the comics and picks out the top 3 or 4 best fashion statements in the comics for the last week. They're concentrating on fashion, and you have all of these things that draw in the female. And of course, this also leads to other things like their art, which is hyper realistic, which drives away, I would say, male audience, but the female want it to be hyper realistic so that they can pull out more emotion from those faces, things like that. Another way that they actually want to make it more female friendly is to have cutesy characters. And I did another video about this. It's called All Marvel Comics Will Look Like This in the Future. And it had a picture of Squirrel Girl. And in that video, I talk about the fact that you have these women on the Women of Marvel podcast. And this podcast specifically too as well, which I'll link in the description. They talk about Squirrel Girl, how much they love Squirrel Girl, and how much she is the best character. So you might think that they are actually just being dramatic when they say that. No, if you want to go listen to this podcast specifically, the last one that just came out, you have them talking about the fact that Squirrel Girl's catchphrase, which is, I have the power of a squirrel and the power of a girl, should actually be as important as the catchphrase from Spider-Man, which is, with great power comes great responsibility. They think that the Squirrel Girl catchphrase is just as important. Why? Because she has the powers of a girl. And she uses those powers of a girl in order to solve most of the problems. And that's why they think it is so important. They think this cutesy character is one of the things that Marvel should actually just put its foundation on. And other cutesy characters, like the last Women of Marvel podcast, they talked about Spider-Ham and how they wanted more Spider-Ham, which is the pig Spider-Man. And other ones, they talk about Lockjaw. They want cutesy characters, again, to attract the female. But of course, this drives away the male. Also, Sana Amanat has talked on a number of occasions about body diversity and how that is important. So basically, they don't want the hyper fit people that we have in our superhero comics. No, they want dumpy people and overweight people and everything else in their comics. And I talked about that in one of my earlier videos, which is Marvel VP says to fans, no one wants the old stories. They might think they do, but they don't. And that's Sana Amanat quoting there, and it's from a Fast Company video that I link in the description of that video. And she talks about body diversity as being extremely important. So again, I would say you have the female, they want to see themselves in this body diversity, whereas you have the male, and they want to see an idealized form, this Greek godlike form that we see in our comics. Also, you have in this last podcast, these women talking about how food in the comics is something which is very important. Talking about food to them is very important. They don't see this as being thrown in as something which is just a sideline. They think this is extremely important. You have all these people like Marika Tamaki and all of these other writers. They constantly have food shoved in the faces of their characters. This is, according to them, quite specifically to make them human and to make them more identifiable to the female. I'm telling you right now, as a male, that's really just something that distracts and takes away from the storytelling. You also have, in the second last Women of Marvel podcast, these women talking about how they love exposition. They love these giant word balloons where these people go on and on and on and just talk and talk and talk and sit there and talk. They love this. They think that it is the expression of emotion, and how they talk and talk and talk actually is something that draws them in. They're quite specifically talking in that podcast about how there was 12 issues of The Runaways, and it was just people sitting around talking, and they couldn't believe that it had been 12 issues because they just flew by. They just loved everything that was written there, quite specifically. And at the same time, you have C.B. Cebulski on the Voices of Marvel podcast talking about how Runaways is not actually supposed to be a superhero comic. It is a teen drama. That is quite specifically what they are producing it for. It is a teen drama. Okay, so you have all of these things. They are things to draw in the female, and I would say at some extent they exclude the male, and that is quite specifically done, because if you have this institution of comics and it has a mostly male audience, but women and men are supposed to be completely equal, then obviously there is some internalized misogyny in that industry, and therefore they have to get it out. They get it out by promoting the female and demoting the male at the same time. That's what these things are all intended to do, and that's what I call feminizing these comics. So how does this all lead to the answers to the questions that I had at the first? Well, why do you have some people that are comic pros driving away, specifically driving away customers saying, this comic isn't for you? Why? Because if they say it to you, you're of the old guard. You're of the people who want that institution to stay the same. You want it to be the way it was before. And if you are the person who wants it like that, then you need to go away, because they need to reform this entire institution so that it's more female, because that's specifically what they're trying to do. But the biggest question that it answered for me was, why do you have these people looking like they deliberately want to fail when they write these comics? Because I would say you have three kinds of writers, okay? You have the female writers and the people who can write in a female way, like all of these things that I'm talking about, and just stick them in there all over the place, like the food and the body diversity and the massive amounts of exposition and the fashion and the hair. They just put that stuff in. It's already there. Then you would have people which are simply lazy and know that they're not going to be fired, and therefore they just don't give a crap. And people like that would be Sina Grace. And I did a video about that, saying Iceman writer Sina Grace boasts that it's not my job to know how Iceman's powers work. But you have a third kind. And this third kind is the people who deliberately fail. Now, why do they deliberately fail? Because they do. They do deliberately fail. Because, of course, if they write a good story, if they write something that is going to draw in a big audience, who is that audience going to be? Well, that audience is going to be mostly male, because that's who the major audience for comics is. And if they do that, they will be supposedly appealing to that old institution of comics where misogyny is just baked into it. Therefore, if they actually write a really good story that people actually like, their job is going to be in jeopardy, because obviously they're appealing to mostly men. And in appealing to mostly men, they will be appealing to in what most people in the company would think of as misogyny, and therefore they must have some kind of internalized misogyny in order to actually appeal to these people, and therefore they'll look at them sideways and go, yeah, maybe we don't want you here after all. So they quite specifically have to fail. All right? They can't actually write a good story. They can't actually write a great story that will appeal to people, because if they do, it will be a sign that they are appealing to men, and then they will be called misogynist. And this then leads to the answer to the last question that I had. Why does Marvel spam out comics? Why? Because if you deliberately can't write a good story, then of course the only way that you can actually make any money is by spamming people. Because spam actually works. And so that's what they're doing. They're spamming out comics because they cannot actually write a blockbuster. They cannot actually write a really great story, because if they do, they will have to be appealing mostly to the male, and if they do that, they're going to put themselves in hot water. And I know that this is another long video, but I have to stick this in at the end. I find it really, really funny in the comments where I have these people accusing me of being misogynist and just doing all of this because I hate women, when they don't actually realize that I actually have a couple of degrees which are focused on the analysis of these specific types of issues. So hey, maybe what I say actually has a little bit of merit, but you can take it or leave it. So, if I gave you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a message. Tell me what you think about deliberately failing comics. And also, you can look in the description for each of those videos to find the links to the podcasts and the interviews and the videos that I use for sources for all of these points. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.